The Joyful Friar Podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar Podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. Last week, we introduced a new story in a trilogy. That story was about Craig, who lived much of his adult life from a wheelchair. In the dream where he first brought his story to me, there was almost no detail in it. All I got in the dream was there's a man sitting in a wheelchair and he's really angry. And I woke up. It had the texture, I don't know how else to explain it, of a contact dream and not my own psyche. And it turned out that indeed this man, who later told us his name was Craig, had been an athletic guy. He thought of himself as kind of handsome and with a winning personality. He loved his motorcycle and the life he was living, but he had an accident. He went on his motorcycle, he missed a curve and flew off the road and emerged from that accident paralyzed from the waist down. He went into some detail about how angry he was and how frustrating it was to have to sit in your own filth and have someone else wipe your ass. That's what he said for the rest of his life. His guardian told us he didn't think of his wheelchair as an instrument that helped him move. He thought of it as his jail cell. And his guardian said, I'm not speaking out of school. He can hear everything I'm saying, but one of his issues was that he could be a kind of glass half empty person a lot of the time. And because of that, he was often angry and unpleasant company. If you're unpleasant company long enough, you quit having company. And so he grew more and more isolated. He told us that he had a tiny little place where he lived that had the ramps that he needed to be able to get about. He had enough of a kitchenette where he could scramble an egg and make a cup of coffee. But he didn't like his life, but then he died. He explained to us that his afterlife experience was that he understood that he wasn't in a wheelchair anymore, but his guardian had to kind of read him the riot act and say, there's no reason for you to be limited anymore. You're as mobile here as everyone else is. You've got nothing holding you back physically, but you could use a change in temperament. Well, what would you do if somebody told you you could use a change in temperament? Well, it was the truth. And he said, I knew you before your accident, and you could be a very charming, winning kind of guy. And you could be yet again if you allow yourself to. You just need to do a bit of a change of temperament. Well, Charlie received that as the truth, and it's a good thing that he did. He told us that on whatever scale there is that makes a person vetted to come into the line to move into my sleeping consciousness, he said, they told me I was just barely qualified, but I was qualified. And they said to him, this place, this level that you're at in the afterlife has about it a kind of therapeutic and kind of quasi-hospital quality to it. And you had enough of hospitals and healthcare settings in your life. We really would like you to move you on from here to better things. We just need your cooperation in order to do so. So he agreed, and we were able to get to work. Well, if you followed last week's episode, you know, we pray to the divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We pray to the angelic persons, especially Saint Michael the Archangel. We pray to some of the saints, especially including Mary, the mother of Jesus. We usually include Mary Magdalene, whose feast it is today as I'm recording this, and many others, to protect ourselves and to call upon their wisdom and to provide a kind of clear channel of communication to do this work. Well, it turned out that the person who came for him to help him move along at the end of the session was Charlie, the watch repair guy. And you can go back into last week's episode and learn about that in more detail. But in the little town I grew up in, Groves, Texas, there was a a little store, was a liquor store on uh, Main Avenue, and behind it there was a little hut and a sign that said Charlie's Watch Repair. Well, Charlie's Watch Repair was a little hut, pretty much like what Craig described having lived in, where this man named Charlie, who was confined to a wheelchair, lived and worked on watches. That's how he made his livelihood. Well, my dad knew about Charlie being there, and once in a while would say to my brother or me, "Hey, let's go visit Charlie." And he would do that, around 5 o'clock, cocktail time. And he would go and they would pour a drink and they'd sit and have adult conversation. I might have been about seven or so, the way I'm remembering it. Um, so not interested in what two adult men were talking about, but we just came along and, maybe we played on the floor. I don't know what we did. Anyway, Charlie came through and helped Craig move along. My dad also got in the mix. Well, I always love it when my dad does that. I'm going to be reading from the second of two transcripts. We always keep a transcript or a recording that gets transcribed of our sessions when we're helping someone cross, is what we call it. But then if we want to tell their story publicly, we always go back and ask for their permission, maybe do so. And we record that session too. And last time I didn't reference that very much, but I'm going to rely more heavily on it today. So um, we had we in order to ask permission, one of my prayer partners and I uh, said our prayers and asked to speak to Craig or Charlie. But the first one we got was my dad, which was very sweet. Um, my dad said, his name is Max. He said, "I'm honored to be part of the work that Nathan's doing and that you're helping with." He was talking to my prayer partner, Phil, through me. He said, "It's interesting that of all the things that a father and a son could have as a common memory, that Nathan recalled that those brief visits, they weren't frequent, but they stood out to him in a way that he's now a 70-year-old remembering that time." He said, "It's true. I could have gone there by myself, but I usually took one of my sons or maybe two of them together. They didn't have anything to contribute other than being there, but I thought it would be good for them just to go to visit somebody who lived alone a lot. They didn't really know anybody that I'm aware of that was confined to a wheelchair. And when in the days when my children were growing up, this would have been the early 60s, he said they didn't have all those laws about sidewalks and ramps and accessibility and special parking spaces and all of that. That all came later. In those years, it was easier for somebody like Charlie to just live in some tiny place, in his case, behind a store, and be largely unseen and unknown. I just liked the guy. I didn't want him to be all alone. One thing that guys could do would be to have a drink together. So almost all the time that we ever visited, I'd go in the early evening when you might have a drink. He also mentioned a memory that I brought up about my dad having compassion for poor people. There was this poor family near our farm in Louisiana, which was 2 hours away from where we lived most of the time, that sold eggs. Uh, and then I shared a memory of us having winter grass, ryegrass for our cattle. And turnips grew well with the ryegrass, and we used to have to go door to door giving away turnips to the neighbors when we came home. He just said it was kind of funny, my dad was saying, my children didn't really know poverty. They knew that I had grown up in poverty, but they didn't know it themselves. But I wanted to make sure that they were never too very far removed from it. He also said, my parents, my grandparents, um, late in life had very little money, and he had to support them too. So he said, being compassionate towards poor people was part of the picture of being a part of our family. So that was my dad being compassionate. He had suffered in his childhood during the Depression and launching in his early life. He largely had to fend for himself, certainly did financially. He never really did lose compassion for other people who were poor or presumed they were only poor because they were lazy or some such thing. Um, he just saw, if he saw somebody that was poor, very often he would want to do something to help. And then Charlie wasn't financially poor. He had a livelihood and he had a roof over his life, but he was in a wheelchair. Well, anyway, my dad did come through and he said, "I'm really not that important to this story." He said, if this was a movie, I'd be one of those tiny little names that goes by in a hurry at the end of the movie. But if you want my permission, you got it. So here's my okay. So that was my dad's part in that one. I always enjoy when he visits. He doesn't do that an awful lot, but it's always pleasant when he does. And he's always on task too. He knows that there's work to be done, and he doesn't just stop by to chat. He's kind of focused. He's a hard worker. He used to People used to tell him when he did begin to be more financially successful later in his life, people would say, Max, you sure are lucky. And he loved to say, yeah, you know what? The harder I work, the luckier I get. I remember him saying that a lot. The harder I work, the luckier I get. When he was parting from us, he said, well, I was a man who prayed, and I can pray for these fellows if they need my poor prayers. And he said, I think you have a way of saying when somebody stops talking through him that they slide to the side. And he said, I think that's as good a way of thinking of it as about any other I can think of. So I'm going to slide to the side, but I'll be praying with you. So if you want to, after you pass, ask for Max Castle. He loved to be around people. Then we found that Craig was up next. And of course, this is now Craig's second time to talk with us, the first time since making his passage. So he said, I did think I was a pretty athletic guy, and suddenly the bottom half of my body was useless. He said, I think that my guardian said instead of thinking of the wheelchair as a useful tool, he thought of it as a cage or something like that. He said, well, that's the truth. I resented that wheelchair. I wanted the damn thing to go to hell. I just love that. He was a pleasant person to be around for somebody that was so unpleasant. I don't know how to explain that. Well, Phil just said, well, first of all, welcome. We're glad you're here. We have a couple of questions for you. And Craig said, okay, shoot. And Phil said, well, presumably you have no mobility issues anymore. And he said, no, I don't. So Phil said, I was curious if you spent any time reconnecting with the old you, the outdoorsy athletic guy that you once were. And he said, well, it's funny, whatever people think heaven is or afterlife. And he said, this priest just uses the word afterlife. But the first part that I was in wasn't exactly heaven on earth or heaven after earth or heaven between worlds. I was still angry in some sort of clinic thing. They tried to help me get over myself. Well, as you know, over the years, since I've been public with this kind of work, people very often do ask about the physics of it or the location. Where are these people you are helping? And they're going somewhere. They're not staying in the same place, and they're going to another place. How does that all work? Well, the reason that I record and transcribe things is so that you have pretty much a kind of fly on the wall experience of what it's like. You might draw your own conclusions. Anyway, he just said, I'm no expert at any of this, but I was in some sort of clinic-like place. They tried to get me over myself. And when I arrived after that, with you guys helping me cross, people might wonder, what does it mean to be outdoors in heaven? Do you go in and out of buildings? Do you leave your house and go behind it into the woods? How does it work? Well, he said, I've wondered about it. I wasn't a particularly religious guy, and I'm no theologian, but just being here has made me pay attention to some of those questions and ask them from a non-religious, non-professional point of view. Okay? That's fair, don't you think? Um, he said, I think one simple way to put it in a sentence is that if this is heaven, and he said, I'm borrowing from Father Nathan, but if heaven contains every good, earth certainly contains many goods. All the earthly goods would have to be a subset of the heaven ones, right? Well, I remember being taught that in first grade. I was quoting my first grade teacher, and he was quoting her. So if people think it's ridiculous to think that there would be a forest in heaven, well, no, it isn't, because forests are good. Being in a forest can be enjoyable. It's just that here there's no bird with a broken wing. There's no tree that's being attacked by something that could kill it. I don't know how it works, but even on the earth, you could see things like decay and understand that a dying or a dead tree is decomposing and it's becoming the raw material of a new one later. But still, you did have to observe that something was dying or breaking or whatever. I don't know how it works, but I've only seen that things are vital and beautiful and they're all in their prime. And then there's this interesting, he didn't think of himself as a theologian, but one of the things theologians do is pose questions. They wonder about things and they put their wondering in scholarly language and categories. Anyway, Craig said, now what does that mean for parasites? Do they get to thrive? Isn't there some sort of beauty in a bed bug or suddenly or something that you wouldn't want to have around? I don't understand that. And I'm not going to load up this conversation with my ignorant musings on that, except to say that, yes, I'm enjoying the outdoors and I'm enjoying my mobility. So I really grew to love Craig because he's so plain spoken. And remember, we were told by his guardian and himself that he wasn't very good company. Well, I kind of like being around him. He said, now I don't have any impediment. I'm just as mobile as anybody else. But then the question became, are you going to move about like other people because you're in charge of movement, your own movement? They put it to me like that, and they said, do you really want to have the attitude of a cripple? Do you want to stay handicapped? Because you can if you want, but we're here to try to help you out of that frame of mind. And then Craig said, well, geez, does that need to be some long, slow slog? Do I need to gradually, bit by bit, choose to be somebody that can run and play? No, I pretty much decided I could turn on a dime. And after I did an afterlife conversation, I thought, well, what the hell? Is it okay if I just experiment and go dashing down the hall? And I did. When I saw that I was good as new, I had to let my emotions and my imagination catch up with that. I think it's brilliant. Um, Compassionate response to his story. Is there any way that you could form the thought, does whatever seems like it's holding me back, does moving forward from it need to be some long, slow slog? Do I need to change gradually, bit by bit by bit? Or could I choose to be somebody that just runs and plays? Well, later in the story, he did said, well, he was talking to you. He said, you're going to be telling my story to other people, so I want to talk to these other people and say that if you think that that's the only thing that you can do is to move gradually, bit by bit by bit, well, okay, that might be your moment. But try to push against that a little bit and challenge yourself to see if maybe that's not your only option. He mentioned the wheelchair again, and he said, don't do as I did. I don't mind being a negative example. If you have to live your life from a wheelchair, well, then make friends with the wheelchair. Well, if you think it doesn't have to be a wheelchair, if there's anything else that you find is limiting to you in your life circumstance, can you change your attitude about the circumstance? Do you really have to want the wheelchair to go to hell? Is there a way that your temperament, your attitude could change about a thing? I wish I had done that. If anybody is just mad at the world and mad at the wheelchair and mad at legs that don't work, that's an option. If it's your current option, so be it. But don't believe a lie you tell yourself that this is the only attitude you could possibly have. Well, as a person who's done pastoral counseling and who have had people call to make an appointment to talk with me, presumably the act of knowing that they would like to talk to somebody about their circumstance you might presume that they're open to change. Many times that's true. Sometimes people aren't so much open to change and motivated to change. They're just in misery. And sometimes misery loves company. You've heard that, haven't you? And they want someone to commiserate with them. Could that be you? Do you sometimes think there's no way out of the misery that I'm in? The best I can hope for is that somebody will commiserate with me. Well, this second part of a trilogy, we've chosen to call it compassionate response. Compassion is an attitude and an attitude that moves into action towards people who are suffering. It means to suffer with. That doesn't have to be commiseration. And if I find after a while that people are making several appointments with me because they really want someone to commiserate, someone to be with them while they're miserable, I'll just say to them, I'm not really very good at that. There's probably other people in your life who could fill that role better than I could. I don't really have patience for that, and I'd rather just be upfront and say so. It's not that I won't do that at all. It's just that after a while, I begin to be kind of inauthentic, and that's no good. Anyway, he just said, don't believe a lie that this is your only option, the only attitude you could possibly have. Don't limit yourself with your own angry thoughts. Then he's quoting me. He said, this Father Nathan man has a way of saying to people, if you want to think sad thoughts, put a timer on and let yourself do it for 5 minutes. And then talk to your sad self and say, okay, sad self, you had your turn. Now it's time to do something else. We're not going to spend the entire day being sad or angry about something. And that's true. I do that, and I recommend the practice. If you have a smartphone, it probably has a timer on it. Set the timer. I choose 5 minutes, and I hardly ever need to get to the end of the five. It's just the action of doing that makes me think. I'm in charge of my emotions. I'm the one in charge of my thoughts and my feelings. And I don't want to deny myself um, legitimate sadness, but I'm in charge, and I'm not going to be sad all day. We can be sad for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll go on to something else. That might not work for you, but it works for me. And I have that at least to try to pass along. And he even quoted me. He said, after my accident, I wasn't very kind. What about you? Are you very kind? I wasn't very thoughtful. What about you? Are you thoughtful? The facts that my legs didn't work anymore, my sufferings, didn't make me more compassionate for other people's suffering. It just made me isolated. There were other options. If it doesn't feel like you have other options, go ahead and note that and then challenge it. Is it really true? Are there options that I haven't seen yet because I'm not looking for them? And am I not open to the possibility that they even exist? Could I be different than I am? Well, remember, he grew into this version of himself after his death. He's just saying there was nothing about dying that made this automatic. I just had help here that I listened to and who challenged me in truth and said, there's nothing holding you back except your temperament. You'll change when you want to change, when you choose it. So that's Craig talking to us. He said, part of what I was shown in my afterlife stuff was that if I wanted to keep being that way, I certainly could, but people weren't going to fail to notice it or to call it to my attention. It was their job because it was the thing that was holding me back, and they were healers. You wouldn't be a very effective healer if you let somebody just stay in their misery. Um, that attitude was the thing that was keeping me unhealed. They compared it to dirt in a wound. If you saw dirt in a wound and you're a healer, wouldn't you clean the wound? But you might need to ask the permission of the wounded person. May I clean your wound? They would say, well, there's dirt in the wound. Would you like us to clean it? They just put it to me in ways that made sense and made my resistance seem stupid. I didn't like stupidity in anyone. In fact, stupidity annoyed me quite a lot. This is Craig. I didn't mind calling you stupid if I thought you were stupid. Phil was on the other end of this, and he said, well, I'll keep that in mind. And Craig said, okay, so far you haven't been stupid. Just don't say anything stupid for the rest of this call and we're good. So we had a little laugh about that. Um, Craig did say we felt like we were kind of beginning to wrap things up, and he said, well, you're kind man, and you want the world to be a better place. You're trying to tell these stories of brokenness and resilience, death and resurrection. I think that's one of the ways he uses Christian language to talk about it. Um, and he said, whether you're a religious person or not, and remember he wasn't, he said, I think built into the universe, the earth before you die and everything after it that I've seen, it's just the way things are. Things really can get better. There's no reason that people have to be held down because of some previous experience. There's always the opportunity to do something next and something new. Do you think that's true? There's no reason that people have to be held down because of some previous experience. There's always the opportunity to do something next and something new. Well, it's part of why I do this podcast and, label it the Joyful Friar. Because if you can't be joyful today, could you be wait in joyful hope that things will turn and something new and happier could be in your life? Well, Phil said, well, that's great. Thank you so much for coming forward. We could feel it was kind of wrapping up. And Craig said, well, that's all the profundity I have to offer. I think we've exhausted it. He's funny and humble. He didn't have anything more profound to say, so he said, I'm going to stop talking. Well, Phil said, before you go, you and Charlie, now that you've met, you both had this history of having lived much of your adult life in a wheelchair. Do you guys still hang out? And Craig said, well, a little bit. People that you see on occasion are happy to get updated about each other. Neither one of us is joined in the hip or interested in being pinned down. I think it's safe to say of him that he's having adventures too, because his life was about as small as mine was. And then he said this, although I think Charlie found a way to deal with it, with his disability, by working on tiny things. If his world was small, he got to work on an even smaller part of the world and improved it. There'd be people that had a wristwatch that didn't work and they didn't know how to fix it. But Charlie could get in there with his little tools and work with his hands that worked and his eyes that worked. His feet and legs didn't, but his hands and his eyes did. So he used what worked. And he made it a livelihood for himself and he made people's lives better. And Phil just said, well, there you go. There's a message for folks who are living with issues or disabilities. And Craig just said, figure out what works and what you have to work with and work with it. Well, next time when we go into spiritual practice, I'm going to deal some in scarcity and abundance because you can think of yourself as having a life of scarcity when the bottom half of your body doesn't work and you live in a wheelchair. But like Craig said, well, Charlie figured out what did work and he worked with that and he made the world better and he served people. So that was Craig. We're almost done. And then Charlie did come on toward the end, and he said, well, this guy, this me, was only a little kid crawling around on the floor while his dad and I visited. Um, and we were just two adults talking about things that wouldn't interest a child. So he doesn't really remember much of it except being there. Um, but he said, one of the things that can happen to a person who is in a wheelchair, they might not get this much exercise and they might become overweight. And he said that happened to me. And he said, but I don't have to be overweight. I don't have to be any particular age. I don't have to be the age that I was when I died. So I become a younger version of myself that doesn't have to live in a wheelchair. And uh, he said, he was talking about Craig. He said, Craig was talking about how you can go into the woods, but there's no tree that's dying or no bird with a broken wing. And then Charlie was not a religious person either, but he's musing about what the afterlife is. And he says, maybe there's another part of it because it is the universe after all, and it's enormous. I'm still looking through a peephole the way I was before. It's just that I can see a little bit more than I used to. But whatever it is that I'm around now, it's really beautiful and fun. He was talking about limits that people can put on themselves that are not absolutely physical. Yes, he didn't have legs that worked, but he also had an attitude that kept him more limited in his freedom than he now wishes. Charlie said I didn't know Charlie's backstory at all. He never talked to family. I didn't know why he was in a wheelchair. Had he been born with something that made that necessary, or had he been in an accident? He said, "I'm not going to go into any of that. It's really not pertinent." But he said, "I did die, and I got here, and I realized I could wiggle my toes. That was all it took. Once I realized that my lower body worked in the afterlife, uh, I got it pretty quickly. I wasn't really an unhappy person. I had to make up my mind not to be. You could come and knock on my door and expect to be well met and welcome." Um, he did go on to say that Phil kind of wondered if Charlie had become a big part of our family's life, and he had not. But he explained that, and he said, um, "We were just two men chattering, two adults chattering in ways that wouldn't interest a child." And then he said, "No, I don't think that I had some kind of afterglow, like, wasn't that wonderful that Max visited, or isn't he a wonderful fellow? I wasn't invited over at Thanksgiving or any such thing. It was just what it was. It was a pleasant little courtesy call, two guys having a drink and enjoying each other's presence for a little while." And Phil said, "Okay." And Charlie said, "Well, he also brought me broken stuff. Not just watches or clocks, but little small appliances, maybe a vacuum cleaner, lots of little machines run on the same principles of gears and maybe fan belts or something." And he said most people wouldn't have owned the tools to fix these things and wouldn't have known how to fix them anyway. And so sometimes I got to do that. And then Phil said, "Well, I guess there's nothing that breaks in the afterlife, so you probably don't have." And then Charlie butted in and said, "Yeah, I'd be out of a job if I was a watch repairman here." They both had a laugh. He said, "That served me well for as long as it did, and I haven't chosen an occupation yet. I've been gone quite a while and have been here quite a while, but it doesn't even seem like it. Seemed like it could have been yesterday. Maybe because my circumstance, I didn't have a lot of immediate family around me, and Nathan doesn't know about my backstory anyway. There's no reason to go into that here." But then I love this part. He said, "I always liked history and geography. I like those subjects. I like to know not just where people lived to begin with, but what it was like to be there and what it was like to live there. And then could you take any point on the map and think, well, what was New York City like in 1500? What was Manhattan Island like when the Indians lived on it? Or what happened next and next and next after that?" I didn't just want to know about wars and kings. I wanted to know kind of, I think they call it social history, learning about what people ate and how did they grow their food? How do they get from place to place? What do they do for entertainment? This is still Charlie. He says, "So I've been kind of floating around." You can go in and out of time, which is kind of fun. You can go into spaces or spheres, however you think of it, wavelengths, where you can kind of, it's more than just seeing a documentary about a thing. You can sort of be inside the thing. So I've been doing a little bit of that. There's some kinds of museums and stuff that try to recreate that kind of thing. You walk into a room and there's somebody in a costume that gives you a tour. They're playing a role and they help you spin wool or something like that. And then Phil said, "Well, I'm kind of a sci-fi geek. It makes me think of Star Trek, the TV series, and the holodeck." And Charlie said, "Oh yeah, the holodeck. Well, that whole thing was built on the idea of future civilizations and spaceships and all of that. But this place where you could go and be immersed in another time and place." Um, Finally, Charlie said, "You know, there's still an application because we can still pray for people on the earth." I was taught that, as a little Catholic child, that the souls in purgatory, they were called, could pray for us and we could pray for them. And he said, "We can still pray for people on the earth. What can you do from here to make things any better for people that are still where you are?" Well, I don't know. That's one thing. I wasn't very religious, but I've learned that you don't have to use religious categories to necessarily be a helper. So even somebody like Charlie that might not have used formal Catholic Christian language to do so thinks of himself as someone who tries to help people who are still here upon the earth. And Phil said, "Yeah, that's wonderful." He said, "Well, we're good. If anybody finds Craig or me to be people they'd like to know better, all they need to do is speak from their heart and we'd hear them." Well, so Craig, and particularly Charlie, have said, if you'd like for me to be your friend, all you got to do is ask. Speak from your heart, I'll hear you. Well, that's Orthodox Catholic Christian understanding of things. That's what I was taught all the way back to being a tiny little kid. So that brings us to the end of that conversation and the transcripts that came from it. Next time, we'll conclude this trilogy with what we call spiritual practice, and there are a lot of spiritual practices in here, some of which you could probably write and contribute. I just found that this story and the men in it, Craig, my dad, Charlie, Craig's guardian, um, I just thought this story was really rich, and I'm grateful to my prayer partner Phil for uh, curating it, going through different stories that we've been a part of, and saying, "Hey, this one would be one that might be make for a good trilogy on the podcast." So that's it for this episode of the Joyful Friar Podcast. Remember, if you would like to be in touch with me, especially if you find, if you didn't know very much background about how this process works, I ask that you read one of my Afterlife Interrupted books first. You can see, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see over my shoulder the third book in that trilogy. But they're all available on Amazon. They're not expensive, and they don't even take that long to read. They're pretty easy reads, I think. Um, so if you wanted to be in touch and ask a question about it and this kind of thing, that's what I'd prefer you do first. Remember, too, that I pray for you regularly from my heart. And the thing that I'm most interested in is the dirt in the wound. Is there, is life wounded you in some way that you're not healing from very quickly or thoroughly because something is maybe beyond your sight? You don't really know there's a problem, but there is. I believe the Holy Spirit of God can find its way into all the little cracks and crevices of our bodies, minds, and spirits, our consciousness, and bring to the surface something for us to bring forth healing in us. I want you to be joyful, and I don't want anything that's happened in your past to steal your joy. So that's how I pray for you when I do. Thanks for being a part of this podcast. I hope you'll join us next time for the conclusion of this trilogy, the spiritual practice based upon the story of Craig and Charlie, the watch repair guy. God bless you. Bye now.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless. Have you ever had to do something so difficult that you had to deal with it in stages? Imagine dying suddenly with no forewarning, being in a car crash, a shooting, a drowning. You leave your body, but then what? How do you transition into the afterlife? For some, it flows all at once, but not for everybody. For some, the process of transitioning into the afterlife is interrupted. Maybe there's a need for rest or for learning, or maybe just the chance to adjust to such an abrupt experience. I'm Father Nathan Castle. I'm a Catholic priest. About 23 years ago, the Holy Spirit began to send me people who had died traumatically. They entered my dreams during sleep, showing me what had happened to them and asking for help. They had died and moved on, sort of, but they'd come to a moment where it was time to complete the crossing. With the help of the angels and saints and earthly prayer partners, we've assisted more than 300 souls as they complete their crossing. You can read about it in my book series. Afterlife Interrupted books are available on Amazon. You can also learn more by visiting my website, nathan-castle.com. nathancastle.com. God bless you.